Taehyung's sudden IG story disappearance sparks chaos. What did it reveal about Jungkook before it vanished forever? The rain was relentless that night, thrumming against the glass panels of Taehyung's penthouse window like 1,000 tiny fists, demanding answers. He stood still in the center of the dimly lit room, his phone clenched in his hand, the soft glow of the screen illuminating his tense expression. A single bead of sweat rolled down his temple, not from heat, but from the weight of what he had just done. The story was gone now. 23 minutes and 36 seconds, that's all it took before he deleted it. But it had already spread like wildfire. The damage was done. Or perhaps, the truth had begun. He hadn't meant for it to slip out. Not really. Maybe some buried part of him wanted it. A whisper from a part of his soul he tried so hard to silence. The story was just a video. A fleeting 5-second black and white clip. No context. No caption. Just the faint sound of laughter echoing under a street lamp, and a shadow that unmistakably resembled Jungkook stepping into frame, only to disappear again. Taehyung sank onto the edge of his velvet couch, fingers trembling as he scrolled through a sea of notifications. Taehyung's IG story, was that Jungkook? What did we just see? Is this a clue? The internet was unraveling, threads of theories intertwining, some grounded, others spiraling into delusion. But Taehyung didn't care about the chaos. His mind was caught somewhere else, back in a memory that still haunted him. It had been 8 months since that night in New York. The alley behind the venue. The fight. The silence that stretched between them after that, longer than any stage they'd ever stood on. Colder than any winter they had weathered. That night, Jungkook had walked away. Fists clenched, lips tight, and eyes burning with something unspoken. Taehyung hadn't stopped him. And maybe that was the worst part. Now, with a single impulsive post, the quiet had been shattered. The door creaked open behind him. Hyung? Taehyung's eyes closed for a moment, bracing himself for the voice he had replayed in his head 1,000 times, but hadn't heard in person since that night. He turned slowly. Jungkook stood in the doorway, soaked from the rain, black hoodie clinging to his frame, jaw tight. "You posted it," Jungkook said, not as a question, but as a quiet accusation. Taehyung swallowed. "I deleted it, but you posted it." Silence. The air between them cracked with tension. Thunder rumbled distantly. Jungkook stepped into the room, the door clicking shut behind him. "Do you want to talk about it now?" His voice was lower, roar like gravel underfoot, like something that had been buried too long. Taehyung stood up. "You weren't supposed to be watching." Jungkook gave a soft, bitter laugh. "It was about me. Of course I was watching." The rain intensified outside, shadows shifting on the walls, flickering with every lightning flash. Taehyung's gaze dropped to the floor. "I miss you," he said, the words barely audible. Jungkook exhaled sharply. "You don't get to say that after all this time. After everything. I didn't know how to reach you. I didn't know if you'd even care. I cared too much." The silence this time wasn't comfortable. It was heavy, filled with pain neither of them had spoken aloud. The kind of pain that leaves bruises on the soul. Taehyung moved closer, each step careful, deliberate. "You think I posted that story to get attention? To make headlines?" Jungkook's jaw tensed, but he didn't answer. "I posted it because I wanted you to remember," Taehyung continued, voice shaking. "Not the fight, not the silence, but the moment right before that when we laughed, under that stupid flickering light, before everything collapsed." Jungkook's eyes softened slightly, the edge of his anger blunted by the honesty bleeding from Taehyung's voice. "You should have just messaged me," he murmured. "I did," Taehyung said. 100 times. Just never hit send." They stared at each other then, the weight of their shared past pressing down like the storm outside. The room seemed to breathe with them, every second stretching into eternity. Then Jungkook walked past him, sitting down without a word. He pulled off his hoodie, raked his fingers through his damp hair, and looked up. "So, what now?" Taehyung blinked, startled. "What? You called me with that story. Whether you admit it or not. So I'm here. What do you want from me?" Taehyung sat across from him, feeling suddenly like he was 17 again, confused, reckless, full of feelings he couldn't name. "I want you to tell me if there's still anything left." Jungkook didn't reply immediately. His eyes searched Taehyung's face, hungry for answers, haunted by doubt. And then he nodded, just once. "There's still everything." The breath Taehyung had been holding escaped in a trembling sigh. The storm outside began to fade into a gentle drizzle. But inside the room, something else was beginning, something unspoken, raw, and real. Something that might have been love all along. And this time, neither of them looked away. The air in the room was still thick with unspoken emotions, long after Jungkook had taken his seat across from Taehyung. The silence didn't feel like peace. It felt like aftermath. Like walking through the wreckage of something that once burned too brightly. Outside, the rain continued to fall, slower now, like the world itself had taken a breath. But inside, the storm had only just begun. Taehyung leaned forward, elbows on his knees, hands clasped together. His eyes flicked to Jungkook's face, studying it in the dim light. There was something about the way Jungkook sat, shoulders tight, jaw clenched, fingers rhythmically tapping on his knee, that told Taehyung he hadn't come just to listen. He had come with weight in his chest, and maybe answers. "Did you ever think about posting something too?" Taehyung's voice cracked the silence, low and uncertain. Jungkook tilted his head. "Every day," he admitted, his voice softer now, more fragile. "But I didn't want to be the one who looked back first." Taehyung smiled bitterly. "And I didn't want to be the one who looked desperate." Their gazes locked, old pride burning like coals beneath the surface. "You weren't desperate," Jungkook murmured after a moment. "You were just honest." Taehyung looked away, suddenly unable to hold the weight of Jungkook's honesty. He had always been the composed one in public, the unreadable one, the image that couldn't be cracked. But Jungkook had always seen through him. There was a pause, then Jungkook asked, "Why that clip?" Taehyung closed his eyes briefly. "Because that night, before everything, I was happy. You looked at me like I mattered. You always mattered." Taehyung's lips parted as if to respond, but the words caught in his throat. The memory returned so vividly. Jungkook standing beneath that flickering light, laughing, reaching out and tugging Taehyung's scarf playfully. Their faces had been inches apart. His cologne, spicy and sweet, had filled Taehyung's lungs. It was the kind of moment that lingered in the bones, long after the heart gave up. "I miss that version of us," Taehyung whispered. "I don't," Jungkook replied, and for a moment it felt like the world tilted. Taehyung flinched, but Jungkook leaned forward, eyes shining. "Because we can't go back to being versions of ourselves. We can only move forward. I want to know who we are now." The clock ticked in the background. A car passed outside, headlights painting shadows across the floor. Taehyung stood, walking to the window. "I'm scared," he admitted, voice trembling. "Scared that we're just chasing ghosts, that what we had was a moment, not a path." Jungkook joined him at the window, standing so close that their shoulders nearly brushed. "Maybe," he said. "But even ghosts leave fingerprints." Taehyung turned to face him, the city lights catching in his eyes. "Do you still—" "Yes," Jungkook answered before he could finish. The confession was quiet, but the impact was thunderous. Taehyung stared, breath caught in his throat. Jungkook smiled slightly. "I don't need the story to know what I feel. But maybe the world did. I didn't mean to make it public. I think some part of you did." Taehyung didn't argue. He couldn't. They stood in silence, two souls tangled in unfinished sentences, and the ache of what-ifs. Then Jungkook reached into his hoodie pocket and pulled out something small, a chain. At the end of it, a pendant glinted. Taehyung recognized it instantly, the gift he had given Jungkook before the tour. He thought Jungkook had lost it, but he hadn't. "I kept it," Jungkook said, eyes soft. "All this time." Taehyung's fingers brushed against the pendant, heart clenching. "What do we do now?" he asked, voice barely above a whisper. Jungkook looked at him, really looked at him. "We start with coffee. Then maybe we stop pretending we don't care." Taehyung's laugh was wet with unshed tears. "Coffee? Don't knock it. The best stories begin at coffee shops." And somehow, that was enough for now. They moved through the apartment slowly, quietly, like they were afraid to wake something sacred. Taehyung made the coffee with shaking hands. Jungkook sat on the bar stool, eyes following every movement. There was comfort in the ordinary, in the clink of mugs and the scent of roasted beans. Taehyung handed Jungkook his cup. Their fingers touched briefly. They didn't talk much as they sipped, but their silence was no longer cold. It was shared. When Taehyung finally looked up again, he saw the way Jungkook's gaze lingered on him, not with nostalgia, but with longing. Present, awake. Later that night, after Jungkook had left and the storm had faded to a distant memory, Taehyung scrolled through his phone again. The deleted story couldn't be recovered. But in the end, it didn't matter. The person it was meant for had seen it. And maybe, just maybe, that was all it ever needed to be. Somewhere across the city, Jungkook stared out his apartment window, the pendant in his hand. And for the first time in a long while, he didn't feel alone. The next morning, Taehyung woke up to a message from JK. Let's not let it vanish this time. And with a shaking smile, Taehyung replied, Not again. Not ever. The morning light crept slowly across the wooden floor of Taehyung's apartment, brushing against forgotten books, an empty coffee cup, and the blanket he hadn't realized he'd curled up with on the couch after Jungkook left. He blinked awake, his phone still in his hand, the last message from Jungkook glowing on the screen like an ember that hadn't died out overnight. Let's not let it vanish this time. The words echoed louder than anything else around him. He didn't rush to reply. Instead, he let them sit there, weighty and terrifying and hopeful all at once. A part of him wanted to leap. Another part of him, the cautious one that had built walls from old bruises and half-spoken regrets, wanted to pull back. But silence hadn't saved them before, and it wouldn't save them now. He typed slowly, deliberately. Not again. Not ever. And hit send before he could talk himself out of it. It was strange how something so small, a simple message, could shift everything. Jungkook didn't reply immediately, and Taehyung didn't expect him to. They were walking on new ground now. Unfamiliar. Raw. But perhaps, finally, honest. He stood, stretching his arms above his head, and glanced outside. The city looked washed clean by the rain. Like it too was trying to start again. By noon, Taehyung was back in the studio. He hadn't planned to be there, but something inside him told him to go. The place still held echoes of the notes sung side by side, laughter over lyrics that didn't rhyme, the hush between takes when they simply looked at each other and knew. He ran his fingers over the keys of the piano, not playing, just remembering. His breath hitched when he noticed the notebook still tucked under the monitor. The one Jungkook had scribbled in the day they wrote their last track together. He opened it. On the corner of the page was a doodle, a half-finished sketch of Taehyung's profile. Beneath it, scrawled in small, rushed letters, "He sings like he's remembering something I forgot." Taehyung's fingers trembled. A knock on the studio door startled him. He turned. Jungkook stood there, hoodie pulled up, eyes hesitant. "I didn't know if I should come." Taehyung didn't move. "You're here." Jungkook stepped inside slowly, eyes darting around like he too was seeing ghosts of who they'd been. He walked up to the piano, hands tucked into his sleeves. "You kept the notebook." "I never touched it. It felt sacred." They stared at each other, and for a long time, neither spoke. Then Jungkook pulled something from his pocket. A USB drive. "I wrote something," he said. "A few nights ago. Before I saw your story, I didn't know if I'd ever show it to you." Taehyung hesitated. "Do you want me to listen to it now?" Jungkook nodded. "Only if you're ready." Taehyung inserted the USB into the computer. A single track. No title. He hit play. The song began quietly. Just a piano, slow, melancholic, familiar. And then Jungkook's voice entered. Soft, almost trembling. The lyrics weren't polished, but they were real. "I watched you leave before I said the truth. You looked back once, but I blinked and lost you. Now silence sleeps where laughter used to live, and I would give anything to hear it again." Taehyung's throat closed. He couldn't breathe. It was everything they hadn't said, wrapped in melody, pain and longing and apology. He didn't realize tears were slipping down his cheeks until Jungkook gently reached out, thumb brushing one away. "I didn't mean to write a goodbye," Jungkook whispered, but it turned into one. Taehyung reached for his hand, holding it tightly. "Then let's rewrite it." Jungkook smiled, broken and radiant all at once. They stayed there for hours, talking, listening, pausing, only when words failed them. And when night fell, They stood on the rooftop, the city lights sprawling around them, stars barely visible but still there. Like hope. You know what I hated the most? Jungkook asked quietly. Taehyung turned. What? The day we stopped laughing. Taehyung nodded slowly. Me too. Jungkook looked down, kicking at the edge of the rooftop gravel. I thought you were happier without me. Taehyung stepped closer, their shoulders brushing. I thought you were safer without me. A bitter laugh escaped Jungkook. We're both idiots. Painfully. They laughed. For the first time in a long time, it wasn't forced. It wasn't empty. It rang into the night like music, like healing. And then, without meaning to, without planning it, Taehyung turned and kissed him. Not dramatic, not performative, just a gentle press of lips. A moment sealed with warmth and understanding. Jungkook didn't pull away. The kiss deepened. The rooftop spun with memory and desire and the long ache of lost time. When they parted, breathless, Jungkook rested his forehead against Taehyung's. So, what are we? Taehyung smirked. Maybe we start as a maybe. Jungkook chuckled. I'll take that. They didn't rush it. The days that followed were quiet, careful. Late-night messages turned into early morning coffee. Studio sessions evolved into songwriting marathons, where they rediscovered the rhythm they'd once shared. Sometimes they fought about old wounds, about fears that hadn't vanished, but they fought to stay, not to leave. The fans noticed, of course. They always did. A subtle glance on stage. The way Jungkook touched Taehyung's shoulder during an interview. How Taehyung laughed at something no one else heard. The rumors reignited, but this time, neither of them hid. Neither of them posted cryptic IG stories to distract. They simply existed closer, warmer. One night, during rehearsal for an upcoming performance, Jungkook stopped mid-note and turned to Taehyung. Do you regret anything? He asked. Taehyung thought about it. All of it. The silence. The bitterness. The distance. The pain. No, he said. Because we're here. Jungkook nodded. Then let's never go back to pretending. That night, Taehyung posted something again. Not a story. A permanent post. A photo of the piano. 2 mugs of coffee beside it. The caption read, "Some songs take time." He tagged Jungkook. The internet went wild. Speculation soared. But for the first time, Taehyung didn't read the comments. He didn't need the world to confirm what he already knew. Some things don't vanish. Not really. They wait. And when they return, they echo louder than ever. They didn't talk much the next morning, but their silence was no longer a void. It was full alive, with an understanding that didn't need translation. Taehyung had fallen asleep with his head resting lightly on Jungkook's shoulder on the studio couch, the faint glow of dawn spilling through the high windows, casting soft light across tangled hair and tired, hopeful eyes. When he woke, Jungkook was already making coffee in the tiny kitchenette, humming low under his breath. A melody Taehyung didn't recognize, but instinctively felt was new, unfinished. Like them. Jungkook looked up as Taehyung approached, still groggy, still blinking sleep from his lashes. You drooled on my hoodie! Jungkook teased without malice, a soft smile tugging at his lips. Taehyung blinked, dazed, then smirked. A small price to pay for emotional reconnection. Jungkook laughed. It was small and rough, but it was real. The hours moved slowly but with ease. They didn't force anything. Jungkook sat with his guitar across his lap, fingers idly strumming, while Taehyung read from a notebook of lyrics, occasionally stopping to hum test lines that didn't quite fit. It wasn't about creating something for release. Not yet. It was about remembering why they ever created in the first place. Music, for them, had always been the language between the lines. But just as their rhythm began to resettle, reality knocked. A message from their manager lit up Taehyung's phone. A reminder of a press shoot the next day. Individual schedules that still didn't align. Brand appearances, campaign obligations, none of it malicious. Just life. And the machine. Taehyung looked up from his phone. We're going to have to go back out there. Jungkook nodded, a quiet tension creeping into his shoulders. I know. Are we ready? I think we don't have to be, Jungkook said, setting his guitar down. I think we just go and keep each other grounded while we do. It was a simple truth, one that steadied them both. They left the studio in the late afternoon. Cameras waited, of course. Some fans. A few paparazzi. Whispers. Flashbulbs. Taehyung hesitated before stepping out the door. Jungkook reached back, gently brushing his fingers against Taehyung's wrist. "I'm right behind you." That was all he needed. The following days were a blur. Fittings, lighting checks, interviews. But something had changed. It wasn't in their words, it was in their eyes. In how they stole glances. How Taehyung's voice softened when he answered questions that touched too closely to feelings he couldn't name. How Jungkook smiled. Not because the cameras wanted him to, but because he was watching someone who made him forget they were even there. It wasn't long before the questions came. "You two have been spending a lot of time together again. Is there something going on? What does that last post mean? Some songs take time? Is that a hint?" Neither of them gave a definitive answer. But they didn't deny anything either. And fans knew. The ones who had always known. They saw the difference in how Taehyung's hand lingered on Jungkook's back as they walked off stage. In how Jungkook's eyes found Taehyung's in the middle of a laugh. In how both seemed more like themselves when they were in the same frame. But not everyone was supportive. Speculation morphed into scrutiny. Online narratives twisted intentions. Headlines formed their own truths. Is Taekook becoming a distraction for the group? Should they dial it down? It reached them, of course. Even if they didn't want it to. One evening, Taehyung returned to his apartment to find Jungkook already inside. The door had been unlocked. The trust had always been there, quietly. Jungkook sat on the couch, his jaw tight, phone in his hand. "Have you seen this?" he asked, tossing the device onto the table. A harsh article, misquoted statements, hateful comments. Taehyung didn't pick it up. He sat beside him, slowly, letting the silence hold first. "I have," he said quietly. "They're making us villains in our own story." "No," Taehyung replied, looking at him. "They're just scared of a story they don't understand yet." Jungkook's eyes burned with something close to frustration. "Sometimes I wonder if it's worth it." Taehyung didn't answer right away. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees, hands clasped. "Do you want to disappear again?" he asked, voice low. Jungkook flinched, almost imperceptibly. "No," he whispered. "But I'm tired of fighting for the right to exist how we want to." "Then don't fight. Just live." Jungkook turned, eyes searching his. "And if they tear it apart anyway?" Taehyung's gaze was steady. "Then let them try. But not before we give ourselves a chance." That night, they didn't sleep much. Instead, they talked. About everything. The tour where they first realized something between them wasn't quite brotherhood. The moments backstage when silence said more than performance ever could. The fear, the guilt, the confusion, and how, through it all, they always returned to each other like gravity. "You once told me I was your home," Jungkook murmured, lying beside Taehyung on the couch, their legs tangled beneath a blanket. "You still are," Taehyung replied without hesitation. In the months that followed, things didn't get easier, but they became clearer. The group had conversations, honest ones, some uncomfortable, but necessary. The members, brothers by choice, not blood, stood beside them, even when the world didn't. And then, one night, Taehyung made another post. A soft photo. Jungkook asleep, face turned toward the window, light painting gold across his features. It wasn't provocative. It wasn't dramatic. It was quiet. Sacred. He captioned it simply, "Safe." The comments exploded. Love, hate, confusion, celebration. But for once, none of it mattered. Because later that night, Jungkook reached for Taehyung's hand under the covers, fingers twining with his, and whispered, "We're still here." Taehyung didn't reply. He didn't need to, because they were. Still here, still choosing. It was a quiet kind of defiance. The way they chose to love each other now without theatrics, without announcement, without asking for permission. Not as a statement, not as a scandal, just as a truth. One that didn't fit neatly into the frame of what the world had expected of them. And yet, in the silent corners of their days, it bloomed. Jungkook had started staying over more often. Not always planned. Sometimes it was just after a late-night rehearsal, when the roads were too empty and the silence too loud. Other times it was because Taehyung's voice, over the phone, had sounded more tired than usual. And occasionally, it was neither of those things, just a quiet understanding that they needed to be near each other, even if no words were exchanged. On one of those nights, Taehyung had fallen asleep on the studio floor, records strewn around him. A worn Polaroid of the group curled beneath his arm. Jungkook had found him like that, limbs sprawled, expression soft, guarded only by dreams.
He didn't wake him. Instead, he lay beside him, head close, and whispered, "I missed you even when you were right here." And Taehyung, not fully asleep, smiled in the dark. But not everything was soft. Some days the weight returned, the scrutiny, the misinterpretations, the pressure to perform happiness when they were still stitching pieces of themselves back together. One morning, Jungkook sat in front of the mirror in his dressing room, foundation being applied to hide the bags under his eyes, a stylist chatting about the upcoming shoot, unaware of the way his hands were clenched so tightly in his lap that his knuckles ached. The mirror showed him a version of himself he no longer fully recognized, perfected, poised, palatable. Taehyung appeared behind him, quiet as a ghost. He met Jungkook's eyes in the mirror and didn't say anything at first, just looked, steady, sure. Later, after the cameras stopped flashing and the staff thinned out, Jungkook leaned against the wall in the hallway. The collar of his shirt tugged loose, makeup smudged at the edge of his jaw. Taehyung joined him, water bottle in hand, offering it without a word. "I don't know how long I can keep pretending some days," Jungkook admitted, voice rough. "Like I'm not exhausted by everything." "You don't have to pretend with me," Taehyung said, his fingers brushing Jungkook's briefly. "You never did." There was a quiet moment, heavy with memories, old shadows, the kind of silence that knew too much. Then Jungkook turned, searching Taehyung's face. "How are you so calm?" "I'm not," Taehyung answered. "I'm just choosing not to drown." Jungkook nodded slowly, exhaling like he'd been holding his breath for days. The next week they recorded a new track together, not for the public, not for an album, just for themselves. They called it Breathe. The lyrics spoke of narrow hallways, of voices too loud to silence, of skin that remembered pain, and of a love that didn't scream to be seen but settled quietly in the marrow of their bones. They didn't release it, not yet, but they listened to it often, in cars, in the dark, on long walks when neither wanted to talk. One night after a particularly long shoot, they took the long way home. Taehyung insisted on walking through the park instead of taking the van. Jungkook didn't argue. The city was alive around them, but it felt distant, muffled beneath the weight of night. They found a bench under a tree, away from the streetlights, and sat in silence for a long time. "You know," Jungkook said suddenly, his voice barely more than a whisper, "if someone told me 5 years ago that we'd be here, like this, I don't think I'd have believed them." Taehyung tilted his head back, looking up at the few stars brave enough to shine through the city glow. "I think I always knew," he said, "even when I was pretending not to." "Pretending what?" "That I didn't love you." Jungkook turned to look at him, eyes dark, wide, soft. "And now?" "Now I'm just trying not to lose you again." The honesty cracked something open. Jungkook reached for Taehyung's hand, sliding his fingers between his, grounding himself in the warmth. "You're not going to," he murmured. They stayed like that, their hands joined, their breaths visible in the cold air, time slowing down between heartbeats. They didn't talk about the future, not in specifics, not yet, but in that moment it didn't matter. The future would come. It always did. What mattered was that they weren't hiding anymore. Back at the dorms, the others noticed. Not because they were told, but because everything unspoken between Jungkook and Taehyung had become quiet music, tangible only to those who listened closely. Namjoon said nothing but offered them both longer hugs than usual. Yoongi simply nodded, a knowing kind of approval in his silence. Jimin smiled more, his laughter easier, as if something heavy had lifted. Hobi pulled them into the kitchen one evening and made them both their favorite late-night ramyun, humming under his breath like nothing had changed. But something had. And it wasn't just between them. Their fans felt it too, in the energy, in the art, in the spaces between lyrics and in the pauses during interviews where glances said more than any script could. Some called it a return, others an evolution. Jungkook began drawing again, sketching in the early mornings when he couldn't sleep. One of his sketches, Taehyung asleep in the sun, head tilted, lips parted in a half-smile, was tucked into the back of his phone case. He didn't show it to anyone. Taehyung took up photography again, framing shots that captured light differently than before. His camera roll filled with moments most people would scroll past. The curve of Jungkook's smile from behind, the way his fingers drummed against his leg when deep in thought, the silhouette of his form leaning in a doorway, just watching. They were healing slowly, carefully, not perfectly, but honestly. And one evening, weeks later, Taehyung opened his phone and began typing. He posted a story. A video. Black and white. 5 seconds. The same street lamp. The same laugh. But this time, at the end, Jungkook turned toward the camera and smiled. There was no caption. None was needed. The world watched. And they finally no longer ran. The internet exploded within minutes. Not in chaos, not in controversy, but in stillness. A kind of collective breath held across millions of screens. The short clip posted by Taehyung, barely 5 seconds, was more than a callback. It was a confession. A nod to everything they had buried, everything they had run from. But now, Jungkook had turned toward the camera and smiled. No words. No explanation. Just that moment. And that moment was enough. The fans didn't need a statement. They pieced it together like archaeologists unearthing something sacred. They saw the way Taehyung's shaky camera steadied the second Jungkook came into frame. They heard the way the laughter didn't echo this time. It stayed, low and warm, like it belonged. They noticed the frame lingered for half a second longer than necessary, as if neither of them wanted it to end. And for once, the world didn't feel entitled to more. They watched and they understood. Quietly. Deeply. Reverently. Back in their shared space, Taehyung sat on the edge of the bed, his phone face down beside him. The tension in his chest was a strange mix of release and exposure, the feeling of stepping outside after holding your breath for too long. Jungkook entered the room carrying 2 mugs of tea, steam curling between them, softening the cold that had been clinging to the edges of the evening. You posted it, Jungkook said, not accusatory this time, just surprised, almost gentle. Taehyung didn't look up immediately. It felt right. Jungkook handed him a mug, the heat a comfort between their fingertips. I thought you'd be scared, he said after a moment. I am, Taehyung admitted, but I'm more scared of hiding again. Jungkook sat beside him, knees touching, their bodies leaning subtly into each other, like gravity knew what they didn't have to say. There were no fireworks in that moment, no declarations, just the quiet comfort of truth laying down between them like a blanket they hadn't known they missed. Taehyung sipped his tea and set the cup down. Then, slowly, as if testing the edge of a new reality, he turned and rested his head against Jungkook's shoulder. You know what the story really meant? He asked quietly. Jungkook hummed in response. It wasn't about nostalgia. It wasn't about reminding anyone of the past. Then, it was about proving that we didn't break there. Jungkook didn't speak. He just reached for Taehyung's hand and held it tighter. That night sleep came easy, the kind of sleep that followed release. When they woke the next morning, the light was different, warmer, brighter. The city was still there, the noise, the eyes, the expectations, but something in the way they moved now had changed. Jungkook brushed his teeth beside Taehyung in the mirror, foam at the corners of his lips, while Taehyung fumbled for his moisturizer, eyes half-lidded with sleep. It was domestic, ordinary, sacred. Later, at rehearsal, they didn't talk about the post, not even when their manager approached them with a guarded look, phone in hand. Not even when Jimin raised an eyebrow and smirked from the other side of the room. They didn't need to. The song they rehearsed that day was a group ballad, raw, slow, built on layered harmonies. But in the bridge, where Taehyung's voice took over in a low, almost aching tone, Jungkook instinctively stepped toward him without thinking, their harmonies folding into one another like a breath returned. After the song ended, silence fell. Not applause, just that stunned, sacred silence. Namjoon was the first to speak. That was different. Good different? Taehyung asked, wiping sweat from his temple. Jimin laughed. That was rip your heart out and stitch it back in kind of different. Jungkook smiled. He didn't look at Taehyung, but the corner of his mouth twitched in the way Taehyung had memorized. The performance was aired 2 weeks later. A pre-recorded stage. No choreography. Just the 7 of them in a circle, spotlights soft and low. When Taehyung and Jungkook reached the bridge again, something shifted. Taehyung turned his body slightly toward Jungkook, and for the briefest moment, on live television in front of millions, Jungkook reached out and brushed Taehyung's hand as he sang his line. It wasn't scripted. It wasn't in the blocking. But it was real. It trended for days. GIFs, screenshots, fans writing poetry about a single touch. The #we see you floated to the top of worldwide trends, not in protest, not in chaos, but in gentle solidarity. Not everyone was kind, of course. Some corners of the world remained sharp and resistant, but the warmth was louder, and they heard it. Jungkook found Taehyung on the rooftop that night, hoodie up, cigarette dangling between his fingers but unlit. "Do you regret it?" he asked. "No," Taehyung said without looking at him. "Do you?" Jungkook joined him at the edge, leaning on the cold railing. "No." They stood there, wind pressing against them like a silent challenge. "You think it'll ever get easier?" Jungkook asked after a while. "No," Taehyung answered, "but I think we'll get stronger." Jungkook turned to him then fully, eyes dark and wide. "We already have." Taehyung smiled, slow and quiet. He flicked the cigarette away without ever lighting it and turned to face Jungkook, the city spinning quietly beneath them. "I want to write another song," he said. "Together. Always." And so they did. They disappeared for a while, not in retreat, not in fear, but in creation. A borrowed studio on the coast, wooden floors, salt in the air, ocean wind rattling the windows. For weeks it was just them, bare feet on sand, scribbles on napkins, melodies hummed under their breath while cooking. They wrote about the places between silence, the spaces between words, the language of glances and touches and forgiveness. They called it the things we don't say. When they returned, the album was already being whispered about. But no one knew the track list. No one expected the final song. It wasn't promoted. It wasn't even titled. It was hidden at the end, a ghost track, starting 6 minutes after the final listed song. Just a piano. Then a single voice. Then 2. No harmonies. Just overlapping confessions in half-sung melodies. The fans cried. The world listened. And they didn't vanish. Not this time. They stayed. And for the first time in a long time, they weren't holding their breath. They were breathing. Together, they didn't expect it to matter that much. A hidden track buried in the silence after the album's end, with no title, no description, no announcement. Just 2 voices, raw and unfiltered, recorded in a single take on a rainy night by the sea. Yet somehow that one track shifted something permanent in the atmosphere surrounding them. Not just within the fans, but within the people they were, the men they were becoming. Jungkook had cried while recording his part. Not loudly, not dramatically, just one long, silent tear that rolled down his cheek as he whispered the last line. Taehyung hadn't interrupted. He hadn't even looked up from the piano. He just kept playing, his fingers trembling, his own throat burning from the weight of every unspoken apology hiding in the chords. And now the world knew it too. Not everything, of course, but enough. Enough to understand that this wasn't a manufactured story. It wasn't a marketing stunt. It wasn't a concept. It was lived. And that made it sacred. The morning the album dropped, Taehyung and Jungkook sat at the kitchen table in the soft hush of dawn, coffee growing cold between them as they scrolled through the sea of reactions pouring in, tears, thank yous, videos of armies listening together and crying quietly, subtitles added by strangers who felt the need to share what couldn't be explained. Taehyung looked up and found Jungkook watching him instead of his screen. "What?" Taehyung asked, his voice still hoarse with sleep. Jungkook didn't answer right away. He just stared at him, eyes a little glassy, a little far away. "We did it," he said finally. Taehyung reached across the table and took Jungkook's hand without hesitation. "We stayed." It was a small moment, a simple one, but it felt like the answer to everything they had spent years trying to solve. The company didn't say much. Perhaps they understood there was nothing to manage, no crisis, no explanation owed. The other members responded in their own ways. Yoongi sent a single text. "That last track, yeah, that was real." Jimin called and didn't say a word for the first full minute, just breathed, and then whispered, "Thank you for finally letting the rest of us feel it too." Hobi sent them a late-night video message of himself dancing to the instrumental, grinning ear to ear, tears shining in his eyes. Namjoon wrote them a poem in Korean, posted quietly on a private story, one that ended with the words, "Some flowers bloom in shadow, but bloom just the same." Still, nothing quite prepared them for the first live performance after the release. They stood side by side on a minimalist stage. No flashy lighting, no backup dancers, just a grand piano and an acoustic guitar resting on stands behind them. The song they performed was not the hidden track. It was a new arrangement of an older one they had sung years ago before anything between them had begun. But now the meaning was different. Now the pauses between verses were heavy. Now the glances were longer, braver. Now, when Jungkook's voice cracked halfway through, Taehyung reached over and squeezed his wrist without missing a note, and the crowd collectively exhaled like they had all been holding the same breath. That clip made headlines. But what happened afterward never made it to the internet. Backstage, after the lights dimmed and the applause faded behind velvet curtains, Jungkook broke. He didn't collapse, he didn't sob. He just stood in the hallway outside their dressing room, still wearing his in-ears, still flushed from the stage, his hands shaking. Taehyung found him there, unmoving, his body tense as if bracing for something unseen. "I'm okay," Jungkook said before Taehyung could even ask, but his voice was a lie. Taehyung stepped close. "You don't have to be." For a long moment, Jungkook didn't answer. Then, in a voice so soft it was almost lost to the sound of a creaking floorboard, he whispered, "I was afraid I wouldn't make it through the song." Taehyung's reply was immediate, "But you did." Jungkook's eyes met his, "Because you were there." Taehyung placed a hand on Jungkook's chest, feeling the heartbeat beneath, fast and uncertain. "I'll always be there." And finally, Jungkook let himself fall forward, not out of weakness, but trust. His forehead pressed against Taehyung's shoulder, arms sliding around his waist, and Taehyung held him, tight and still, like the grounding he had become. That night, they didn't return to their individual apartments. They went back to the studio where it had all begun, curling up on the couch they had once argued on, the one where Taehyung had fallen asleep all those months ago after posting that first IG story. "Do you ever think we'll be normal again?" Jungkook asked into the dark. Taehyung shifted slightly beside him. "What's normal?" Jungkook laughed quietly. "Exactly." They fell asleep with their legs tangled, the quiet hum of the refrigerator the only sound in the room. And for the first time in years, Neither of them woke in the middle of the night needing to check their phones. Weeks passed, and with them new challenges came. New performances. New headlines. New pressure. But something about them had changed. They no longer bent under it. They no longer flinched when questions were asked. They answered what they wanted and ignored what didn't deserve their energy. In an interview with a European magazine, Taehyung was asked directly, "What's the most important thing in your life right now?" He didn't blink. "Peace." "And where do you find it?" His lips curved slightly. "In silence, in music, and in people who make me feel like I can just be." The interviewer didn't press. They didn't need to. Another interview, another country. This time Jungkook was asked what the hidden track meant. He shrugged, casual but careful. "It means we're still here." They never said the words, never made a statement. But sometimes, the loudest love was the one that didn't beg to be believed. And still, life went on. Tour resumed, projects piled. Time passed, but they kept each other steady, not just in romance but in friendship, in creativity, in rest. There were days when they fought, about lyrics, about tempo, about schedules. There were nights when one would walk out, only to return an hour later with food and a quiet apology. There were holidays they spent apart, but they always found their way back. One night, months later, Jungkook found a small package on his pillow. Inside, a handwritten note and a thin silver ring. The note read, "You never needed to ask, you were always home." He wore it on his right hand, no explanation given. Taehyung started wearing his on a chain around his neck, under his shirts, pressed to his skin. The fans noticed. Of course they did. But again, nothing was said. And when asked about love or art or healing, they always answered the same way. "We're still learning, but we're not hiding anymore." And in that there was freedom. Real, enduring, unapologetic freedom. The kind they had written into every note. And lived together. The autumn air had grown colder by the time their schedules brought them back to Seoul full time. The yellow leaves outside the studio windows clung to the last of their color before the inevitable shift into winter. Change was always quiet before it settled in fully. And as the seasons turned, so did something between Taehyung and Jungkook, something no longer defined by hesitance or secrecy, but something steady, like the hum beneath a melody that never stops. Most days, they moved like they had always done, practice, record, perform, repeat. But now, there was a new rhythm underneath it all. A glance across the room that said, "I see you," a note added to composition that only the other would understand, a lyric that made them both pause when they heard it out loud. They had become fluent in each other in ways no one else would ever fully grasp. It wasn't just about the quiet moments anymore. It was how those moments shaped the way they carried themselves in the world. They had been asked again and again about the hidden track, sometimes directly, often with caution, but they never answered in the way reporters expected. Jungkook would smile, thoughtful and unhurried, and say, "Some things are meant to be felt more than explained." Taehyung, always leaning just slightly closer to him in those interviews, would simply nod, his silence more revealing than any prepared statement. One night, after a long day in the rehearsal room, Taehyung sat on the floor with his back against the wall, drenched in sweat, fingers aching from playing the same chord progression too many times. Jungkook was nearby, his hoodie pulled halfway over his face, his voice a low hum as he adjusted settings on the soundboard. "You know," Taehyung said, eyes closed, head tilted back against the wall, "sometimes I wonder if we're building something people will remember, or something they'll rewrite." Jungkook didn't answer at first, just let the weight of that question hang between them like the last note of a song still ringing. "They'll rewrite it," he said eventually, standing and walking over. "That's what people do." Taehyung opened his eyes. "So why do we keep building?" Jungkook crouched in front of him, meeting his gaze. "Because we'll remember it right." There was something in the way he said it, quiet but rooted, like he'd found the answer long before the question was asked. And maybe that was why Taehyung reached up without thinking, brushing a damp curl from Jungkook's forehead, letting his fingers linger just a second too long. That night the city outside their windows pulsed with neon life, but inside everything was still. They shared a couch, music playing low in the background, laptops open but forgotten, the soft warmth of proximity enough to keep them grounded. Jungkook was sketching. Taehyung hadn't even noticed at first, but now he could see it, the loose lines becoming something familiar. "Is that me?" he asked, amused. Jungkook didn't look up. "You, before the bridge of Still With You, you had this look in your eyes like you were trying not to fall." Taehyung stared at him, lips parting slightly. "And now?" Jungkook set the pencil down and met his gaze. "Now you've already fallen." Silence thick and charged. Taehyung turned his head slowly, his voice barely above a whisper. "You too." Jungkook didn't answer. He didn't need to. Instead, he leaned in, his mouth brushing just beneath Taehyung's jaw. Not quite a kiss, not yet, but enough to draw a tremble from him. And that was the moment Taehyung tilted forward, closing the space with a kiss that didn't ask for anything except the truth. When they pulled apart, their foreheads pressed together, breath mingling, Jungkook whispered, "You're not a secret anymore." Taehyung's hand found Jungkook, fingers locking. "Neither are you." After that, things didn't change outwardly. They still attended interviews, still performed with practiced grace, still met deadlines, smiled at cameras, answered questions. But beneath the surface, something profound had shifted. They moved with the unspoken knowledge that they were no longer waiting for the right moment. They had chosen to live it. And the fans, those who had been watching, feeling, reading between every line, they knew. Taehyung posted a picture a week later, a sunset from their studio window. The caption was just a lyric, "Even shadows dance when the light finds them." The next day, Jungkook uploaded a short video clip. Just piano chords, fingers brushing keys slowly, the camera never leaving his hands. But at the very end, his voice whispered, "Always in tune with you." It wasn't about confirmations. It was about clarity. Still, the pressure came. A brand deal pulled at Taehyung's schedule, hinting at a desire for cleaner optics. Rumors surfaced of internal tension. A news outlet misquoted one of Jungkook's old interviews, spinning it into something sensational. They sat together in a dim room that evening, press articles spread across the table, frustration simmering beneath the surface. "Should we say something?" Taehyung asked, voice tight. Jungkook looked exhausted. "They'll twist it anyway." Taehyung leaned forward, elbows on his knees. "Then what do we do?" Jungkook didn't speak for a while. Then he reached into his pocket, pulling out the ring Taehyung had once given him, the one he rarely wore on stage but never left behind. "I think," Jungkook said, sliding the ring onto his finger slowly, "we live louder." And that night they did. They walked out of the building hand in hand. No disguises, no rush. Photographers caught them, lights flashed. But they didn't flinch. The next morning the headlines wrote themselves, opinions exploded, but they didn't check their phones. They spent the day in a sunlit room, writing a new song, laughing at nothing, stealing kisses between verses. And when the world asked for clarification, they responded with music. A new single dropped 3 weeks later, a stripped-down ballad layered with strings and silence. No fanfare, no teaser. The title was Yours. The lyrics left little to interpretation. It wasn't a story anymore. It was theirs. And they weren't giving it back. There were no fireworks when the single dropped, no countdown, no press release, no elaborate teaser campaign. It simply appeared at midnight, buried between global releases on every platform at once. Yours. The title alone was enough to make hearts ache across oceans. And for those who had been watching closely, for those who had felt the undercurrent building for years, it was the answer they hadn't dared hope for. The song began quietly, almost hesitantly, with a single chord that lingered too long before the first verse arrived. Taehyung's voice entered like a confession spoken at the edge of sleep, low, breathy, trembling with things left unsaid. The words wove through solitude and longing, painted in metaphors about storms that stayed, about hands that reached through silence. Then came Jungkook, not in harmony but in echo. His verse didn't resolve Taehyung's, it deepened it. Their voices only met in the chorus, layered so closely they became indistinguishable. When the bridge hit, it broke something open. Taehyung's voice cracked on the word always. And Jungkook caught it with a whisper, still. By the end, it wasn't just a song. It was a truth they had hidden in plain sight. The reaction was immediate. Social media flooded with messages, some joyful, some confused, some angry, but most filled with awe. Fans recorded themselves listening, hands over their mouths, tears running freely. Artists posted covers within hours. Critics, even the cynical ones, couldn't deny the vulnerability etched into every measure. And yet Taehyung and Jungkook didn't respond. No tweets. No live broadcast. No follow-up interview. They just disappeared. For 5 days there was silence. Until the photo appeared. Posted to both of their accounts at the same time, with no caption, no tags. It was a blurry film photo, taken in the early evening under soft light. Jungkook sat cross-legged on the floor, barefoot, a pen between his teeth, his gaze fixed on something unseen. Behind him, Taehyung leaned in from behind the camera's edge, his hand resting on Jungkook's shoulder, his smile faint but real. They weren't posing. They weren't performing. They were just there. Together. The world didn't need any more proof. Still behind the curtain, reality persisted. Managers called. Endorsements threatened to back out. A few sponsors pulled deals. Messages flooded their inboxes, some filled with support, others with veiled warnings disguised as professional concern. But they had already made their choice. The first time the label called a meeting to strategize response, Jungkook barely looked up from his seat. "I'm not interested in hiding," he said. Taehyung, seated beside him, simply added, "You don't market honesty." Their tone wasn't defiant. It was final. After that, the energy shifted. They returned to work, returned to music, but they did so on their own terms. And for the first time in years, the studio became a sanctuary again. They began recording an EP, just the two of them, not for radio, not for charts, for themselves. 5 songs, each one written with no commercial structure, just stories, just breath. Just the sound of Taehyung's voice breaking on the second take and Jungkook insisting they keep it. Just the sound of laughter layered over bloopers they refused to edit out. They called it unscripted. And they didn't tell anyone about it. Not even the other members. Not until Namjoon walked into the studio one night, headphones around his neck, eyebrows raised as he listened to one of the rough mixes on loop. He said nothing when it ended. Just looked at them. "Is this your real debut?" he asked with a soft smile. Jungkook chuckled, "Feels like it." Namjoon nodded. "Then I hope they listen the way they're meant to." And they did. The project was released without warning, a quiet drop on a full moon night. No fanfare, no visuals, just sound, just soul. Within hours it trended worldwide. Within days, it was being dissected by every major publication, but more importantly, it was being felt, deeply. One fan wrote, "This isn't an album, it's a letter they've been writing since 2018. And perhaps it was. Each track held a memory, a scar, a promise. By then, it no longer mattered what the headlines said. They had long stopped seeking validation from places that had never seen them fully. What mattered now was the way Jungkook reached for Taehyung's hand without thinking when they stepped onto stages. The way Taehyung let his eyes soften when he looked over during rehearsals, lips twitching at memories shared silently. The way they didn't correct interviewers who referred to them in plural, as a singular force. What mattered was the night they stood at the edge of the Han River, hands buried deep in their coat pockets, breath fogging the winter air, and Taehyung turned to say, "I never thought I'd get to live like this." Jungkook didn't reply. He just leaned in, forehead resting against Taehyung's, the cold biting around them, but the warmth between them undeniable. They weren't trying to be brave anymore. They simply were. In the months that followed, their story became more than a headline. It became a timeline of quiet rebellion, of choosing softness in a world that demanded performance, of staying when it would have been easier to run. They began holding hands on camera. Not for attention, not for protest, but because it was real. They began showing up to events side by side, not caring what questions came, not avoiding the ones that lingered too long. They even began answering with honesty. "Are you too?" a reporter asked one evening, clearly nervous. Taehyung met Jungkook's eyes. And for once, they smiled the same smile. "We're each other's," Jungkook said simply. It was all they needed to say. And as time passed, the noise dimmed. The world adjusted. The fans who had always loved them found peace in the certainty, and those who couldn't accept it faded into the background, swallowed by the sound of music louder than judgment. Years from now, no one would remember the controversy. But they would remember the songs, the way the voices fit, the way two souls found each other on stages and rooftops and silent car rides. They would remember a black and white IG story. The moment Jungkook turned and smiled, spring arrived in Seoul with the kind of soft defiance that neither of them could ignore. Cherry blossoms stretched into bloom along the sidewalks they used to walk separately. Now they walked them together, often in silence, not for secrecy but for peace. Fame had taught them that not everything needed to be spoken, and love had taught them that silence, when shared, could be the most profound kind of presence. Jungkook started waking earlier than usual. He said it was to run before the streets got crowded, but Taehyung knew better. He watched him sometimes, leaning against the doorway with sleep still clinging to his bones, as Jungkook tied his shoes and paused at the door like he wasn't sure if he wanted to run away or simply start again. Every time he left, Taehyung waited. Every time he returned, Taehyung was there. Their apartment smelled like mint tea and clean laundry now. There was music in every room, not always playing but always waiting. Headphones draped over chairs, notebooks with half-written lyrics stacked beside books Jungkook never finished, sketches Taehyung left between coffee cups. They lived in overlapping circles, quiet patterns of intimacy that no one else saw. Sometimes they argued. About lyrics, about tone, about how to phrase a bridge that felt too honest. But the difference now was that they always came back. Jungkook didn't storm out the way he used to. Taehyung didn't retreat into silence. Instead, they would pause, take space, then meet in the kitchen like nothing had shattered, knowing that love didn't need perfect harmony, it just needed truth. Their next live performance was different. It wasn't the scale. The venue was intimate, a candle-lit hall filled with faces they'd seen for years. It wasn't the songs, they chose older ones, familiar and warm. It was the way they carried themselves. Taehyung stepped onto the stage first, guitar slung over his shoulder. Jungkook followed, not behind him but beside. They didn't speak before the first note. They didn't need to. The music did it for them. In the middle of the second verse, Taehyung forgot a line. His fingers faltered just slightly. Jungkook didn't miss a beat. He stepped forward, took over the melody without hesitation, and when Taehyung's voice caught up, Jungkook smiled at him like he had just handed him a lifeline. The audience saw it. The world saw it. And no one questioned it. After the show, they stayed on the empty stage, sitting cross-legged on the floor while the crew cleared cables and dimmed lights. Jungkook stared out at the vacant rows of seats, his fingers tapping silently against his thigh. "I used to be scared of this," he said. Taehyung turned to him. "Of what?" Of being seen. Taehyung studied him, and now. Jungkook's eyes met his. Now I'm scared of disappearing again. Taehyung reached over, placing his hand gently over Jungkook's. You won't. The promise was simple, undramatic but real. That night Jungkook pulled Taehyung to the window of their hotel room, pointing to the city lights that stretched endlessly into the distance. All that noise, he said, voice soft, and yet somehow we found quiet inside it. Taehyung leaned his head on Jungkook's shoulder, because we stopped trying to be louder than it. They stood there a long time, watching the cars move like veins through the streets below. When they turned in for the night, Taehyung pulled the covers up to Jungkook's chin, just like he always did when the other was too tired to move. He kissed his forehead and whispered something neither of them remembered in the morning, but both felt for the rest of the day.